Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding webinar. My name is Elaine Weiss, and I'm the Senior Policy Analyst at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. CHCDF is an education, strategy, and action hub for national organizations dedicated to adequate federal housing and community development funding for lower-income families and communities. CHCDF members, which number around over 60 national organizations, represent a full continuum of national housing and community development organizations, including faith-based, private sector, financial intermediary, public sector, and advocacy groups. Today's webinar will discuss how President Trump's budget proposal could impact affordable housing programs. From recent news, we know that there are significant threats facing affordable housing and community development programs. With that in mind, we want to ensure advocates from across the country have the information and tools they need to help protect these critical resources from severe funding cuts. Speaking on today's webinar, we have Doug Rice from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, Linda Couch from Leading Age, Ellen Lori Hoffman from the National Housing Trust, Steve Berg from the National Alliance to End Homelessness, Tess Hembray from the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials, Marion McFadden from Enterprise Community Partners, and Leslie Strauss from the Housing Assistance Council. As you can see, we have a packed agenda, and I'd like to leave as much time as possible for questions. So before I turn it over to Doug to talk about the budget overview, I'd like to just have some housekeeping announcements. We are recording this webinar, so the slides and the recording will be available after the presentation concludes. And if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please enter them in the chat feature on the side of your screen. So with that, I will turn it over to Doug.
And thanks for joining today. Elaine, could you advance the slides, please? So I thought I'd start with just a straightforward calendar for the year, budget calendar. And I'll note, first of all, that Congresses and the Trump administration, too, their major priorities this year are twofold, really, to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act and then to enact tax reform legislation as well. These are going to be the priorities. These are going to take up a lot of legislative time, and relative to these, appropriations legislation for fiscal year 2018 is really going to be a lower priority. However, it's still going to more or less proceed in the same way that it has in recent years and along the lines of the same calendar. Elaine, I don't know if you did advance it. It doesn't show up on mine. Is everyone else seeing advanced slides? Elaine?
Hi, I'm sorry. We're just trying to get the slide to advance.
Okay. Well, I'll just go on. So we expect the fiscal year 2018 budget process to proceed more or less as follows. So on March 16th, we're expecting the Trump administration to release a budget brief, what's being called a skinny budget here in D.C. Typically, an administration releases a detailed budget request that includes a wide range of entitlement tax proposals as well as detailed account level proposals for each program. But because the Trump administration is new, this budget brief is likely to contain no more than very much top-line numbers. So there may be likely to be an overall proposed funding number for non-defense discretionary programs, which is the broad budget category that includes most housing and community development programs. And it may well include a budget request for the Department of Housing and Urban Development, but it's unlikely to include any detailed program level information. There is the expectation that the administration would release a detailed budget later on in the year, perhaps in May, but it's not clear how much that will even affect the process. So we'll see, we'll get a peek at top line numbers next week, and then Congress at the end of this month in the House will begin work on a fiscal year 2018 budget resolution. That's just a general budget blueprint for the year. The key part of that resolution for Congress is really going to be instructions that will guide their proposals to make major changes in the tax code. But another thing in that resolution will be a proposal, again, for overall funding for non-defense discretionary programs, and it will be this number that the committees, both in the House and the Senate, will use to draft appropriations legislation and work on individual agency budgets for the remainder of the year. In fact, it may take some time for Congress to complete a 2018 budget resolution for complicated reasons that I won't go into. But even if they don't complete a resolution till later in the year, they will probably sometime in April deem overall funding levels for non-defense programs for the purposes of moving appropriations. And then once they have an overall number, the appropriations committees go to work. They divide that number up into 12 pieces, one for each of the subcommittees, and including one for the Transportation HUD subcommittee, which will in each chamber, which will begin drafting legislation. We're likely to see markups of Transportation HUD funding bills in the House and the Senate sometime this summer, maybe as early as May, maybe as late as July sometime. The timing of that is a bit uncertain. But those markups are essential. They give us a clear indication of where Congress is going on HUD program funding. And then it's unlikely that any of those bills, either the House or the Senate, will see floor time this year because of how crowded the congressional legislative calendar is, which means that when the fiscal year ends at the end of September, it's very likely that Congress will have to pass another continuing resolution to temporarily fund agencies while they wrap up appropriations, and then sometime later in the fall, we'll see likely final funding legislation to wrap things up. Okay, next slide, please. So a little more background. As Congress and the administration go to work on the 2018 budget this year, one overarching factor here is the Budget Control Act of 2011, which, as most of you know, put in place very austere funding caps for both defense and non-defense programs. These caps extend through 2021, so they're annual caps. And in fact, these caps have already forced pretty substantial cuts in funding for housing and community development programs. Since 2010, we've seen a $4.7 billion reduction in funding overall for HUD and USDA housing and community development programs. That's an 8.6% cut. Adjusted for inflation. The deepest cuts in terms of funding have been in public housing and the block grants, the home program and community development block grant programs. There was also, following 2013 sequestration, a very steep loss in housing vouchers. We lost more than 80,000 housing vouchers for families from 2013 to 2014, but as Congress provided additional funds in later years, housing agencies have largely restored those voucher cuts. Next slide, please. And here you can see, this just shows changes in funding for major programs since 2010 and the deep cuts, especially in public housing and CDBG and home. Next slide, please. And this shows the number of housing vouchers that families were using. You again see the very steep drop-off following sequestration in early 2013, but those numbers have largely recovered over the last 2 years, thanks to the additional funding that Congress made available as a result of 2 consecutive budget deals that relaxed the BCA budget caps temporarily. But those deals only ran through 2017. In 2018, we're back to the original, what we call sequestration level budget caps. Next slide, please. Oh, actually, I want to mention one other thing just quickly back on vouchers. So and I realize most of today we're going to talk about 2018 budget issues, but there is one 2017 issue I wanted to mention related to vouchers, partly because of the fact that housing agencies have restored tens of thousands of vouchers to use over the last 2 years, in addition to the fact that rents have been rising around the country and incomes of voucher tenants have not really kept pace with increases in rents. A substantial increase in funding is required to renew all vouchers in 2017. And in fact, the amount that's likely to be required is well above the levels that was approved in the House and Senate Transportation HUD funding bills for 2017 that were approved last summer. And so a key issue as Congress wraps up 2017 appropriations, which they're supposed to do by the end of April this year, a key issue is whether they're going to provide sufficient renewal funding to ensure that we can sustain the vouchers that have been recovered over the last couple of years. Okay, so moving on to 2018. So we're still under these Budget Control Act spending caps. The 2018 cap for non-defense discretionary programs is slightly below the 2017 cap in nominal terms. In inflation-adjusted terms, it's $14 billion lower, 3%, and which is a full $96 billion or 16% below the 2010 level adjusted for inflation. So basically, under these austere caps, under current law, we will be losing ground in 2018. In addition, there are some other factors that will make the budget situation even tighter. I'll just mention a couple here. One is that Congress has already approved an increase in health care funding for veterans for 2018. They approved that as advanced funding or as part of the 2017 bill. And so there's that increase that has to be taken into account. In addition, as is the case for 2017, rental assistance renewals, so this is renewals for housing vouchers and project-based Section 8 assistance and smaller increases for the other HUD rental assistance programs and USDA as well. Increases are needed just to sustain rental assistance for current families that are using it. And this is due to largely to rising rents in markets around the country. Together, these things, health care for vets, rising rental assistance costs will just make the squeeze even tighter, especially inside the HUD budget. In addition to that, the Trump administration has already indicated that they intend to propose very deep further cuts in non-defense discretionary program funding, and I'm going to talk about that a bit. Next slide, please. So what the president has proposed is to, in 2018, raise the cap for defense programs by $54 billion and to offset that increased money by lowering funding for non-defense programs by an equal amount. Overall, this would lower funding for non-defense programs by 11%, but after taking into account the increased money that's required for veterans health care and protecting Homeland Security funding, which is very unlikely to be cut in the president's budget request, that means that all other non-defense programs would have to be cut by 15% under this proposal. Now, there's no indication yet of where, or very little indication of where these cuts will fall. although there have been some reports, such as a New York Times article several weeks ago, that indicated that the safety net programs would not be protected. But just to give you a sense, to illustrate what the potential consequences of such cuts would be on rental assistance and community development programs, I calculated that a 15% across the board cut to HUD would eliminate funding for 625,000 housing vouchers and project-based Section 8 units that are currently occupied. And in addition, there would be cuts in other rental assistance programs like public housing that could lead to the loss of as many as an additional 200,000 rental assistance units. On the other hand, if for instance, policymakers decided, well, we can't cut rental assistance for current families because that puts them at risk of eviction and even becoming homeless, why don't we force the rest of the HUD budget to absorb those cuts? Well, the fact is, a 15% cut to HUD would basically eliminate the remainder of the HUD budget, including all HUD staff and salaries, as well as virtually every other program. So this is a long way of saying that there's really no way to reduce HUD funding by 15% without really devastating cuts in rental assistance, the wholesale elimination of other major programs administered by HUD, or really both. Next slide, please. This is just a little chart showing the impact of the Trump proposal, as well as the existing 2018 funding cap under the Budget Control Act. As you can see, in inflation-adjusted terms, so these figures are adjusted for inflation. The 2018 cap is already $14 billion below the 2017 cap, and the Trump proposal would reduce that much, much further to $462 billion. Next slide, please. Okay, so where does that leave us? Well, I want to make very clear that this proposal that's come out of the Trump administration is really just the beginning of the 2018 appropriations process. And it's important to keep in mind that both Democrats and moderate Republicans who support non-defense programs of different kinds will have leverage in the appropriations process this year. They'll have leverage partly because of the filibuster rules in the Senate. So to move appropriations legislation will require 60 votes typically in the Senate, which means you'll need at least 8 Democrats and as well as some moderate Republicans who support many of these programs to move those through. But there are also divisions among Republicans in the House that will make it very difficult for them to move appropriations legislation without moderate Republicans and Democrats there too. So that's important to keep in mind. When we see this request next week, it's important not to panic and to realize that it's only the start of the process. But at the same time, it's also important to recognize that we have a lot of work ahead of us to defend these programs. Second bullet, lawmakers must use their leverage to push to raise the funding caps for non-defense programs, even setting aside the Trump proposal. Funding for in 2018 for non-defense programs will be very, very tight under the current law caps, and we really need to have those raised. And at the very least, if we can't raise the non-defense caps, we have to prevent cuts to them below the current law levels. An important principle in pushing these goals forward is what we call the principle of parity, which is a principle that Congress has essentially adhered to over the last 4 years when it's made changes to the Budget Control Act spending caps. And the principle says that if we raise the caps for defense programs, then we have to raise the caps for non-defense programs by an equal amount because investments in domestic priorities are important too. And then finally, regardless of the decisions that Congress makes about the overall cap levels, it's essential that whatever the cap level is, that HUD and USDA housing and community development programs receive priority for funding when the funding is allocated amongst the subcommittees and specific agencies to avoid deepening the cuts that we've already seen in recent years. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Doug. Before we move on to our next speaker, I just want to reiterate that people could answer or ask questions in the chat feature of the GoToWebinar system. We will answer them at the end of the webinar. So just if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in. Thank you. Our next speaker will be Tess Hembray from the National Association of Housing Redevelopment.
Thanks. So like a lot of HUD programs, public housing has suffered from chronic underfunding for a number of years. Next slide, please. So public housing is separated into two different accounts. There's the operating fund and the capital fund. First off, the operating fund, much like its name, it covers the day-to-day operating expenses of running these properties, covers some preventative maintenance, some energy costs. You see, in FY 2016, HUD was providing only 90% of the estimated cost of running the program. And the current proration right now, because there isn't a full year FY 17 bill in place, is 85%. So this has been a problem for many years, and housing authorities haven't been given the resources they need to run the program at what HUD estimates to be the full funding levels. Next slide, please. The capital fund is even in a more precarious situation. The chronic underfunding here is causing a huge backlog of needed improvements. HUD ordered a study in 2012 from Apt Associates that estimated that the backlog had grown to $26 billion. And keep in mind, this was in 2010. The $26 billion estimate was given. And they estimated that the needs accrued at a rate of $3.4 billion per year. So in 2010, now 7 years ago, there was a $26 billion backlog in capital fund needs. The capital fund really provides funding for development, financing, and modernization of public housing properties. So it's everything you need to do bigger projects to maintain your public housing. In FY 16, the Public Housing Capital Fund was funded at $1.9 billion. So obviously that's a much lower number than the $3.4 billion accrual rate. And that's been a trend in the last several years. The capital fund hasn't gone over $2 billion. The backlog now, based on these estimates, could be as high as $40 billion. And we're losing about 10,000 units per year of public housing. This is a huge, huge crisis in our housing stock. This is 10,000 units per year of stock that's not going to be replaced. And as we're accruing more and more backlog of needs, there's families living in properties that need some pretty big improvements, and it has a pretty big impact on the safety and the health of the residents. So if you look at that number, it can seem like a really huge number, an impersonal number, but remember there's families behind that living in units that need funding from Congress to bring them up to a reasonable condition. So unless Congress provides an increase over FY 16 funding, we're looking at a continued loss of units. The accrual is going to continue to go up, and more families are going to continue to be in conditions that are not conducive to the health and safety of the residents. Next slide, thanks.
Thanks, Tess. Our next speaker is Ellen Lori Hoffman from the National Housing Trust.
Thanks, Elaine. I'm going to be talking about project-based rental assistance, and first I want to take a minute and explain what project-based rental assistance is. PBRA, as we call it, is a public-private partnership that provides rental assistance to property owners if they agree to rent to low-income residents. The PBRA program serves 1.2 million low and very low-income people, and more than half of these households include a resident that is elderly or disabled. The average household income for residents in PBRA homes is less than $12,000. These are very low-income folks. The program, because it's a public-private partnership, leverages over $17 billion in private financing and equity. often in conjunction with the low-income housing tax credit program. And it has other benefits in the private sector as well. The PBRA generates $460 million in property taxes for local municipalities, and it supports 55,000 jobs. We also know that project-based rental assistance creates jobs in local communities in rehabilitation, property management, supportive services for residents, as well as retail and service sector jobs in the communities where the homes are located. So the benefits go to the low-income residents, to the private owners, and to the economy, the greater economy and the specific economy of the community where the properties are located. Next slide. So as Doug mentioned, in the landscape that we're looking at with President Trump's proposed cuts to non-defense discretionary funding, as well as the sequestration caps kicking in, there is a huge threat to funding for project-based rental assistance. And I want to mention that there's also a threat if there is a continuing resolution for the rest of fiscal year 2017. If project-based rental assistance contracts are supposed to fully fund the program for 12 months. If there is not adequate funding in either FY 2017 or in 2018, there will be really put the residents and the properties at risk. And again, the residents are predominantly elderly or disabled. If their units are not fully funded, they could be at risk of losing their housing. Not fully funding project-based rental assistance also would send a very negative message to the private sector community that has invested in this program, and it could erode investor and lender confidence, could create an uncertainty about whether properties are going to be able to meet their debt servicing and operating obligations, and it could really hurt investment or increase financing costs. It's also going to be very difficult for properties to maintain the supportive services that they provide. Many of these properties, through the private owners, provide extensive supportive services, especially for elderly and disabled residents. That's going to be impossible without full funding. It will also be very difficult for owners to meet their debt payments, which puts the Federal Housing Administration at risk to pay the tab. Nearly 10,000 of the over 17,000 properties with project-based rental assistance do have FHA insurance, and the estimated unpaid balance of FHA-insured debt of these contracts is over $13.5 billion, so there is quite a risk to FHA. So we're encouraging people with properties with project-based rental assistance to be in touch with their members of Congress to let them know where these properties are located, who the residents are, and that these are constituents that would really be put at risk without full funding for non-defense discretionary funding.
Thank you, Ellen. Our next speaker will be Linda Couch from Leading Age, who will talk about housing for special populations. Sorry, we're just having a little difficulty getting Linda unmuted.
I think that's it.
There we go.
My role is to provide an update on what's at stake for 3 special population programs under potential budget cuts. The first program is the Section 811 Housing for Persons with Disabilities program. For this program, HUD in the current fiscal year requested full funding to renew all the rental assistance contracts that undergird the 30,000 Section 811 units across the country. For FY18, the next fiscal year, we expect the renewal number to go up about another $3 million. That's how much it went up from 16 to 17. We expect the 17 to 18 number to be about the same. Any amount for the 811 program in FY18 that is below about $157 million will lead to 811 providers receiving insufficient rental assistance for their residents who have annual incomes of about $11,000 a year. So, you know, these aren't programs with massive increases, but these are programs with sort of slow and steady increases just to maintain assistance for people who are already housed. Next slide. For the Section 202 Housing for the Elderly program, there are also annual increased funding needs. In addition to the $200 million increase compared to FY16, that project-based rental assistance renewals need that Ellen mentioned, the 202 account itself needs a $72 million increase for FY17 compared to FY16 just to maintain existing housing. In the 202 account, about a third of all of the rental assistance come from these project rental assistance contracts, and the vast majority of the balance of the rental assistance is from those Section 8 project-based rental assistance. And so we need to see these increases, these sort of naturally occurring increases from one fiscal year to the next just to maintain the housing. For FY18, we expect the PRAC renewal amount to increase by another 3 or 4%, plus whatever the service coordinator renewal need is. So let's say that's around $17 million. Any amount on FY18 below the FY17 numbers plus the $17 million or so will lead to insufficient rental assistance to properties serving Section 202 residents who have annual average incomes of around $13,000 a year. Finally, on the 202 account, we wanted to mention that we are also hoping in the FY17 bill to expand the rental assistance demonstration for PRACs, and we're really worried that a continuing resolution that relies on anomalies for funding or a deeply divided Congress focused on budget cuts will abandon its seeming support to expand RAD for PRACs. Next slide, please. Finally, the last special population program I'll talk about is the Housing Opportunity for Persons with AIDS program, or HOPWA. In FY17, HUD requested flat funding for the HOPWA program. This is a program that just grows a teeny bit when it does grow, and not a shocker that it didn't get an increased request from HUD for FY17. As we all know, HIV is a public health issue, and better individual and community health outcomes are achieved when people are housed, and I would say this is true across all the housing programs. For HOPWA in 2016, Congress passed its first modernization of the funding distribution formula since 1992. This was a much-needed and long fought-for funding formula distribution, formula update. Now the new formula switches distribution from counting cumulative AIDS cases to counting how many people are currently living with HIV and AIDS. But to accommodate for the new formula, there's a needed $15 million increase for FY18. So what's at stake for the HOPWA program, faced with these budget cuts, is that without these additional funds, this additional $15 million for HOPWA, current programs who have been relying on their program funding based on the previous funding formula will see cuts. I think the theme across the special population accounts is that additional resources are needed just to maintain the people who are served. And these programs don't need a 10 or a 15% cut to see real devastating impacts. We're talking about flat funding would be devastating. Not getting a 3 or 4% increase in these programs would be devastating. And so we're watching out for these accounts with our partners very closely. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. Our next speaker is Mary McFadden from Enterprise Community Partners, who will be speaking about formula and block grant programs.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk about the Community Development Block Grant, or CDBG program, HOME, and the National Housing Trust Fund. As you're hearing the concern, the traditional wisdom is that with the HUD budget, the last thing anyone wants to do is take a voucher away to render someone homeless, in part because the House of Representatives is really keyed in to not losing one member, not losing housing for one constituent. So it causes a lot of concern for the HUD Community Development Block Grant and the home program. So the tension there is that if you need to reduce billions of dollars, these could be target programs. As we heard, we're not going to know specifics possibly until May about where those cuts may be coming from. But we hear that the Heritage Foundation policy documents are guiding the creation of the policy, the documents over at OMB, the President's budget, and Heritage Foundation has called for zeroing out CDBG in fiscal year 18. And we've already seen downward trends in these programs. So as you look at this slide, one of the points here is that even where the President has requested a low amount for CDBG, Congress has given more than what the President requested in 6 of the 8 prior years. The program has strong support from mayors and county executives who are very vocal about their support for the program. But you can see generally that there's been a gradual downward trajectory. So I think that the best that we can hope for would be level funding, but it's more realistic to expect that it'll go down. That said, the CDBG program is a great vehicle for infrastructure spending. So we'll see how it plays out between the President's proposed more tax-based plan and the Senate minority's proposal for a more traditional spending infrastructure bill. But CDBG would be a potential vehicle to receive some of that money. Looking at the home program, it's been cut about in half since fiscal year 2010. There was a tough article on the program in the Washington Post and a tough IG report happening around 2011, and the program has not yet rebounded. So both House and Senate bills would put the program at $950 million for fiscal year 17, which would be level with 16 funding. But we're concerned that we may see a proposed cut based on the National Housing Trust Fund, which we'll talk about next. So the Housing Trust Fund actually comes from non-appropriated funds. The funding comes from new originations at Fannie and Freddie. So the amount is not technically controlled by Congress, but we might see that Congress proposes to reduce the amount of home funding appropriated by the amount estimated to come from those GSE contributions. Another potential threat to the Housing Trust Fund would be elimination through housing finance reform. We don't expect to see that this year, but it is possible. And House Financial Services Chairman Henserling has said that he supports the PATH Act and is committed to privatizing GSEs. So I think that's something that as a community we'll be talking about how we can best advocate for inclusion of the National Housing Trust Fund.
Great. Thank you, Marion. Our next speaker is Keith Berg from the National Alliance to End Homelessness, who will be speaking about homeless assistance.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining this call today. I want to start by reiterating what a lot of people have said, that there's going to be a lot of work to do to protect these programs over the next year or so, and we're hoping that this call can be the start of a real movement to do that. Talking about HUD's homeless assistance, the name of the account that the people who write appropriations bills use is homeless assistance. That funds 2 different programs at HUD. The largest one is the Continuum of Care program, which is a competitive program for grants for local nonprofits and state and local government. And the other one is the ESG, or the Emergency Solutions Grants, which is a smaller block grant or formula grant to local government. These 2 programs together in 2016 were funded at about $2.25 billion, and together they fund local systems for ending homelessness. Some of the kinds of programs they fund are rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, transitional housing and local shelters, and then they also very much fund local local activities to have a coordinated system for trying to actually solve the problem of homelessness. These programs are very important. The people who experience homelessness are among the most vulnerable in America. The types of people who are overrepresented in homelessness include very young children, include youth who have been turned out by their families, includes people with disabilities, particularly mental health. A lot of communities have found the rising problem with opioid addiction is very related to homelessness. So these are very vulnerable people, and for the community as a whole, homelessness is a costly problem that pulls money away from other systems and interferes with orderly operation of systems like the correction system, and puts a lot of cost on healthcare systems as well. The HUD's homeless assistance programs provide benefits, and one of the reasons they provide so many benefits to communities is because they have proven to be very effective. The way these programs were administered based on the bipartisan legislation that was passed a few years ago very much encourages communities to get the best possible performance out of the programs. And because of that, investment in homelessness programs has a big impact. That being said, the missing piece still remains money. The homeless programs very much are effective programs, but they do not have enough money to end homelessness. Otherwise, we would be seeing a lot less homelessness. And the proof of that is really in what's happened in the veterans world. The Department of Veterans Affairs has a whole different set of homeless programs for veterans. Those have been funded at a more realistic level for doing the whole job, and we've seen very large decreases in veterans homelessness. We have dozens of communities now that have ended veterans homelessness. This gives an idea of what kind of impact these sorts of coordinated local systems can do. The other thing about these programs, there's something that Republicans and Democrats can agree on. So people are looking for something good you can do that Republicans and Democrats will agree on. Ending homelessness is definitely one of those things. One piece of evidence of that is what has happened so far with the fiscal 2017 bills. As people know, those bills have not yet been passed by Congress, but they have a House committee version and a Senate version. And both the House and the Senate committees substantially expanded the money available for homelessness. They did it in slightly different ways. The House bill is actually a larger increase. But these are illustrative of what we need. The programs work really well. They need more money. They need substantial improvements each year in the reach of the program. We're hoping that when Congress does its 2017 bill, that there is a substantial increase in these programs. We'll see when the final bill comes out. But I think because of some of the things that we talked about earlier, the overall reductions in funding levels, the following year, the 2018 situation looks much more grim. I put up here just a couple of numbers that assume a possible 15% cut in homeless assistance for 2018. Of course, that's far from a done deal. We're very much going to be fighting against that level of cuts with everything we've got. But this shows you what happens if that level of cuts is enacted. It's a $360 million reduction in the program. The effective would be where we estimate that for 2016, HUD's homeless assistance programs will probably assist about 200,000 people from moving from homelessness into housing. The effect of that would be, the effect of that level of cut would be none of that work will get done. The whole amount of money will be spent to keep people in permanent housing that has been funded by the homelessness programs. if you did that, then the effect would be there would be no help available for people who become homeless to move into housing. Or you could do it the other way and keep the programs to move people into housing and take the money from the permanent housing programs. So that would mean approximately 50,000 formerly homeless people who are now in permanent supportive housing, now off the streets, would lose the rental subsidies for their housing. These are devastating cuts, and I think when we are advocating with Congress for overall spending levels for fiscal 2018, we need to keep in mind that these are not just numbers. These are people, very, very vulnerable people, for whom housing is really a life and death matter, and I think we need to be driven by that to make an all-out effort to change the way people are thinking.
Thanks, Steve. And our next speaker is Leslie Strauss from the Housing Assistance Council, who will be talking about rural housing.
Thank you, Elaine. USDA's rural housing programs do all kinds of things. They make direct mortgages for home buyers for production of things like housing for farm workers. They provide administrative support to groups that do self-help housing. But what I'm going to focus on is the rental programs, the rental assistance programs, because it's easier to calculate people with current aid who will lose it for those programs. If they make fewer mortgages, obviously fewer people can buy homes, but if rental assistance gets cut, that means people who currently can afford their apartments will not be able to. There are two programs. One is the Section 521 Rental Assistance Program that's project-based, and it's in USDA-financed rental properties only. The Section 542 Voucher Program is tenant-based vouchers for tenants that lived in 515 USDA-financed properties. When the mortgage is prepaid or foreclosed on, then the rental assistance goes away because the USDA mortgage goes away and the two are tied together, and the tenants are eligible for vouchers. If we get, for fiscal 17, if we get a continuing resolution or a full year funding at FY16 levels without any increases, then inflation alone, as people have been talking about, if you don't increase the rental assistance and voucher amounts to keep up with inflation, then you don't have enough to keep all the units funded, and you'll lose some tenants. In this case, you would lose just over 3,000 rental assistance families and just over 1,000 Section 542 vouchers, and nobody who's newly in need would get rental assistance or vouchers. The bottom of the slide calculates the amounts that are needed. The 542 voucher program is a little harder to calculate. It needs a total of somewhere between 18.75 and 19.5 million. It's worth mentioning that one reason the voucher program is short is because in fiscal 16, the amount that was appropriated, which was 15 million, was not enough to fund all of the vouchers that were needed, and USDA was able to take money from another program, their multifamily preservation program, which is legal, but they're allowed to switch funds between these two accounts, and they had to take $4.5 million from the preservation program to use it for vouchers, and yet if you have a continuing resolution that keeps funding at fiscal 16 levels, there won't be any preservation money to switch into the voucher program because USDA got so many preservation applications in fiscal 16 that it's already committed all of its preservation funds for fiscal 17. So there aren't any funds available from another program that can be switched into the voucher program. Next slide. For fiscal 18, using that wonderful 15% calculation, this is units, not dollars. And the two numbers in red down on the bottom right are the rental assistance and the voucher programs. If for rental assistance, remember I said we'd lose over 3,000 in fiscal 17 if the amount isn't increased to keep up with inflation. If we lose 3,000 in 17, another 3,000 because of inflation in 18, and then that 45,000 plus, we get over 51,000 units lost out of a current 301,000. That's more than 1 in 6 of the current households. That's not only going to make people, throw more people into Steve's homelessness programs, it will also hurt the viability of the properties that the tenants live in. The landlords are relying on this money to help operate the properties, and if they don't get it, other tenants may lose their homes because the properties may go under. With vouchers, if we lose 1,000 units in 17 because of inflation, and then another 1,000 in 18 because of inflation, and then 800 because of a 15% cut, we get 2,800 units. That's more than half of the current 5,300 units who will lose their assistance. And that it's worth mentioning that 60% of the tenants in USDA Section 515 housing are elderly or handicapped. The average annual income for all the tenants, not just that 60%, is under $13,000 a year. And these are folks that don't have other options. They have no other places to go. And on that cheery note, I'll turn it back to Elaine.
Thank you, Leslie. I just want to again thank our speakers who spoke today. From their presentations, you can see that we have our work really cut out for us in the next few months. So that's why it's important for advocates on all levels to be engaged in pushing back against these spending cuts. So here's what you could do. You should reach out to your lawmakers and ask that they work together with their colleagues and the Trump administration to lift the spending caps for fiscal year 18, maintaining parity for defense and non-defense programs, and ensure housing and community development programs receive the highest level of funding possible. And here's how you could do that. If you haven't already done so, please sign on to CHCDF's letter urging Congress to lift the spending caps. So far, we have over 2,000 national, state, and local organizations, as well as local governments, that have signed on, but we'd love to get even more supporters on the letter. When we send out the recording, we will send the link for the letter. Please share the letter broadly with your network. You can also plan an in-district meeting with your lawmakers. As constituents, you have a real opportunity to make an impact with your lawmakers. After all, you're their boss. Members will be back in their districts from April 10th to April 21st, so start trying to schedule a meeting now. You could also invite your lawmakers to a site visit. This is one of the most effective ways of showing to your lawmakers the positive impact of federal investments in affordable housing and community development programs. We hear this time and time again from congressional staffers how important these visits are. You could also write an op-ed and pitch it to your local paper. To help you do all this, we've put together a toolkit that includes CHCDF's new report, A Place to Call Home, that discusses the positive impacts affordable housing has on low-income households as well as the economy. The report presents research on how affordable housing reduces poverty, increases economic mobility and educational attainment, and improves health outcomes. The report includes state-level data, including the number of direct and indirect jobs supported through HUD investments and funding levels for HUD and USDA programs in each state. The report also includes over 100 success stories of people and communities that have been positively impacted by federal affordable housing investments funded through HUD and USDA. These stories are great examples that you could share with your lawmakers, especially stories from your district. We've also provided talking points, sample op-eds that you can modify and make specific to your organization, tweets and how-tos for setting up in-district meetings and site visits. We will also hold future webinars to keep advocates updated on the budget and appropriations process as it moves forward. So please stay tuned for more details. For everyone on today's webinar, we will be sure to send you an invitation for our next webinar. So again, thank you so much again for joining us today. And with that, we could go ahead and take some questions.
Great, thanks so much, Elaine. This is Sarah. I'm going to pose a few questions, and Elaine will kick off who should answer them. We're not going to be able to get to everyone's questions, particularly some of the more specific ones. So you can always email us at outreach@nlihc.org, and we can connect you to the folks who can answer your questions. So to kick us off, we have had quite a few questions about the timing of funding for fiscal year 17 and whether there will be a CR, when will we know if it's going to be a CR or a different appropriation, or a new appropriation for fiscal year 17. So if we can get some clarity around that, I think many folks are interested.
Doug, do you want to take that?
Well, the short answer is there isn't a whole lot of clarity. You know, there are members of Congress, especially in the appropriations committees, who are still pushing forward to complete to include as many complete bills as they can in whatever final appropriations bill they pass. But you know, a lot of that depends on a complexity of related issues, political issues concerning riders and so on, how much time they have to consider measures on the floor. Our sense is that you know, we're expecting to see a defense funding bill this week begin to move through. We're expecting to see a supplemental for defense maybe next week. After the defense bill moves through the House this week, it goes to the Senate. Our speculation, informed speculation, is that it's likely to just sit in the Senate for a while, given how short floor time is in the Senate, and that the Senate at the end of the day will try to move a defense bill, possibly wrapped together with some non-defense funding titles or continuing resolution. But we don't expect this to get wrapped up until April sometime. They're out for 2 weeks in mid-April, so it would either be the first week of April or more likely the very end of April. Now, whether there's a continuing resolution or not, that's, again, a difficult question to answer. Our sense is that the committees have pretty much negotiated a compromise transportation HUD title. So the issue is not in the details. The issue is just what political leadership decides the final form of the bill is going to be, and then they'll move from there. So I don't know if other folks have anything to add. But I mean, I will add that whether it's a CR or a full bill, you know, that doesn't matter so much. What matters is the funding levels for specific programs. Even if it is a continuing resolution, there will certainly be what we call anomalies, that is, specific exceptions for particular programs where they specify funding levels other than the prior year's level. And so it's really the provisions of the bill that matter, and not whether it's a CR or a full bill. Though obviously, if it is a full bill, they can do a lot more in a full bill with respect to tinkering with specific funding levels and maybe potentially policy changes too.
If I could just add, this is Steve Berg again. In terms of timing, it would be a big mistake on the advocacy end to wait until the end of April to start advocating on this. I think just even though the final decision won't be made until probably right at whatever deadline they set for themselves. Decisions are being made behind the scenes now, and it's very important that people here, starting right away, people on the Hill, hear that there's a lot of support for housing programs that they're going to have to address.
Great, thank you so much, Steve and Doug. The next question comes from both for Leslie and Steve about how the projections of voucher cuts are calculated. Both of you mentioned that there would be a specific number of vouchers that would be cut, or people who would be affected. And people were curious about how those numbers are calculated.
Well, I can start with mine. I mean, this is not vouchers. This was in the homeless programs. It's at this point, since we're dealing with sort of a hypothetical budget resolution, it's just taking the money. I mean, we know how much HUD is spending on each permanent housing placement within the homeless programs. We know how many people are in permanent housing. We know how much it's costing. The math tells us, on average, how much money it takes to fund one permanent housing placement. And with the kind of cuts that we're talking about, that's how the math comes out.
I'm wondering if that question was actually meant for Doug rather than Steve, because Doug talked a lot about HUD vouchers. But this is Leslie, and I'll just say the same thing that Steve said about homeless programs is true for the USDA vouchers, which is a separate program than HUD vouchers. There's just an average dollar amount per voucher for the current year, and I used that to calculate. I did not take inflation into account, so it's the effect is going to be worse than it actually seems. Also, I found three different average amounts in three different places from USDA. So I averaged the averages, which I think you're not supposed to do, but they're all in the range of $3,400 to $3,800 per year per voucher.
And, you know, as far as the regular voucher, the Housing Choice Voucher Program goes, we do detailed estimates based on current voucher costs. We have very good data from HUD on that, as well as the numbers of vouchers in use, and then we project likely inflation and rent and utility costs in the next year, as well as make some assumptions about incomes to calculate an average voucher renewal costs, and use that to estimate the effects of cuts. I'd be happy to offline to explain it all in great detail if anyone's interested.
Great, thank you. And we will include in our follow-up email contact information for each of the presenters if you want to follow up individually. The next question is actually about the low-income housing tax credit and how the impact of proposed corporate tax reform will affect the market for those tax credits and how that would impact funding for affordable housing development.
This is Ellen from the National Housing Trust. We haven't really talked about tax credits today because we've been talking more about appropriations, and the Campaign for Housing and Community Development funding usually doesn't deal with tax issues, but I think it's really a good question and it's worth talking about for a minute. So the low-income housing tax credit provides incentives for private investors to invest in affordable rental housing, and it is the #1 and only vehicle for producing or preserving affordable housing that we have, and has basically accounted for all production and preservation that's taken place in the country in the last 30 years. There are two potential threats to the low-income housing tax credit through tax reform. One is that the tax reform could eliminate the tax credit. There has been some talk about Republican interest in scaling back tax credits. That is probably the less likely scenario. We know that the low-income housing tax credit has really strong bipartisan support in the House and the Senate, although you can never know for sure until we actually see the tax reform bill. The second is that the tax reform that has been talked about by President Trump and the Republican leadership is aimed at lowering the corporate tax rate. And if the corporate tax rate is lowered, that can
reduce the appeal of low-income housing tax credits and the yield for them. And so that could really undermine the program and make it less, reduce its capacity for building and preserving affordable housing. So I know that many of the groups that are represented in CHCDF are working to strengthen and, if anything, expand the low-income housing tax credit because it is such an important tool, and certainly working with Congress. And I would just say that, just to echo what Steve said, now is the time to be advocating for affordable housing programs, whether they're funded by appropriations or low-income housing tax credits. If you have properties, you should be letting in your area, let your members of Congress know how important they are.
Thank you. And this is Marian McFadden. If I could just add on to that, I would say to bring it back to the appropriations, the low-income housing tax credit projects also see home is in about 1 out of every 4, as well as vouchers in about 1 out of every 5. So they go together.
Thank you. Well, again, thank you so much to our speakers and to the people who tuned into our webinar. Like we said, the recording will be available, and we'll make sure that all the tools that we talked about on today's webinar will be included in that email. So look out for that tomorrow, and have a great rest of your day.